Hi guys, welcome back to another video from the Aspiring Medics. As always, my name is Yusuf. I'm an Oxford medical student, and I'm also joined by
Hi, I'm Avantika. I'm a first-year medical student at Oxford.
Great, and we're going to be going through an Oxbridge mock interview. These are really hard to find on YouTube. I'm going to be giving you guys some practice and going through our tips as well when we're going through. All right, so without further ado, let's get into it. Okay, so to start off with, I'd just like you to describe the image that you can see below.
Right, so in the image, I think I see that exactly half of the face. I think the left half of the face has a bit of a rash on it, and the rash, I can see a bit of redness, and looks like there are some like pockets of pus in some areas of the face. Yeah.
Okay, pockets of pus. What's pus?
Pus, if I understand, it's like some white blood cells that have died due to when there's an immune response happening in the face, and so they're deposited as part of the pus. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Okay, so what makes you think that there's pus here?
Just because some parts of the rash look like they're sticking out of the face, as opposed to some
Mhm.
other types of rashes that look like they're flat on the surface of the face. Yeah.
Sure. So you definitely have these areas that are raised above the skin, and
Yeah.
they're also got something inside of them as well.
Right.
So, and it could be pus. What else could it be?
Mm, well, if not pus, some other type of fluid, but I'm
Good.
not very sure what. Yeah.
Yeah, it could be any sort of other fluid that
Yeah.
we're thinking about here. But the key thing is, yeah, absolutely. You've got these fluid-filled vesicles that they're called here. That's really good. Anything else that you can see? Is there
Um,
anything that strikes you about this image, would you say?
like other than the fact that it's exactly half of the face, it's like an asymmetrical
Yeah.
rash. Yeah.
Yes, it's exactly half of the face. And you can also, as you say, see this redness as well. And where did you say we're looking? Not a trick question. Where are we looking on the face?
Like the forehead of the face. Yeah.
Yeah, which side?
The left side.
Left forehead. Okay. And what's happened to the right forehead?
Right forehead seems normal. No rash,
Hmm.
no. Yeah.
Okay. What do you think could be going on here?
Right. So since it's a rash, I think the first things I might consider would be like exposure to something that the person is allergic to.
Hmm.
But at the same time, the fact that it's exactly half of the face makes it seem that maybe that's not the case. So
Yeah,
other
unless someone
things,
was
yeah,
wearing some sort of mask exactly on one half of their
yeah,
face. And okay, maybe for Halloween, but otherwise you
yeah,
can't really imagine it happening, can you?
yeah. Other
That's a
things
good
like,
thought.
right, maybe it could be something the person has eaten, something that they're allergic to, but I'm guessing those might that also doesn't explain why it's exactly half of the face. Perhaps like an infection, maybe.
Yeah, so just to
Yeah,
pause you exactly. So
yeah,
if it was something that someone had eaten, i.e. an
yeah.
allergic reaction, well, what do you understand of an allergic reaction?
Um, well, in the case of something someone has eaten, it could
Hmm.
be like it can't be broken down because they don't have like the necessary enzymes for it. Or maybe there's like an immune response to something they've consumed.
Good.
Not really. Yeah.
So there's an immune response, there's an
Yeah.
inflammatory response. Um,
Yes.
and again, why, what would you expect that to be? Would you expect that to be more symmetrical, asymmetrical?
Well, since it's something they've consumed, I guess it would be
Mhm.
like symmetrical relatively, as opposed to what we're seeing here.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. You'd expect it to be quite symmetrical and you'd expect it to be more systemic and widespread inflammation, for example, like the whole face becoming red. And you wouldn't expect these sorts of like vesicles appearing. But yeah, really good thought. Anything else that this could be?
Mm, maybe some sort of infection, maybe
Hmm.
of um still not very sure why it's localized to that one part of the face, but maybe an
Mm.
infection that affects certain cells in the face in that area could result um in the rash being the inflammation only happening on that part of the face. So like skin
That's
cells in
okay.
the face. Yeah.
So, firstly, if we go back, so that's really, really great. So, if we go back slightly, so you said an infection. What can cause an infection?
Like bacteria, viruses,
Mhm.
any other
What
types of
else?
pathogens like
Like
fungus,
what?
fungal
Yep.
infection. Yeah.
Yep. Parasites as well.
Yeah.
So those are other things to also be thinking about. Okay. And have you heard of something called cellulitis before?
No, but I'm guessing it's some sort of inflammation.
Yeah. What does itis mean?
Well, I guess that refers to like swelling, but I'm not too sure. Yeah.
Yeah, swelling, infection, inflammation, right? Tonsillitis, pneumonitis, appendicitis, for
Right.
example. So good. So you might be thinking about, okay, could this be some sort of bacterial infection? And it can definitely cause symptoms similar to this. But again, we go back to the thing that it's very quite rare to have it in that particular distribution of only affecting one side of the forehead. And you were on a great point, and you were thinking about the reasons as to why it might be on one side of the face. And do you want to carry on with that idea?
Um, so if it's on one side of the face, I think it's because there's something on that side of the face that is like not common with like the other side of the face, so that could be the reason why only cells in that area are being affected.
Hmm.
So is it possibly like because it's on the skin? So I'm thinking about what is connected to like cells in the skin or like any receptors present on the skin.
And
Um,
what is connected to the skin?
um, like apart from blood vessels, also nerves and
Nerves. So
yeah,
blood vessels, what types of blood vessels are you thinking?
like
Not a trick question.
capillaries.
Yeah, capillaries. What else?
As in, other than blood vessels, you mean, or
No, what are the blood
what?
vessels that we're
What
thinking
are
about?
blood vessels?
What are the two types? The
As in,
two
like
main types.
capillaries, arteries, veins.
Yeah, arteries and veins, right?
Yeah,
So we can be thinking about those. What else can we be thinking about that isn't blood vessels, that isn't nerve related? There's one more that comes to mind.
like sweat glands as well. I'm not very sure.
Yeah,
Or
sweat glands, yeah.
like,
You can. Mhm.
hmm.
What happens if you get a cold? You can get like these swellings in
Oh,
your
like
neck.
lymph,
What are those called? Yeah,
lymph.
good, like lymph nodes, like in your lymphatic system as well. Great. So we've mentioned arteries, veins, nerves, lymphatics.
Yeah.
What do you think could be going on? What could be going on here? Like out of those ones, what do you think it could be and why?
So because of the fact that it's only like one half of the face, maybe it's
Mhm.
because it's I well, it could be like blood vessels or nerves that only supply that half of the face that are infected.
Mm,
And that is why we only see it on one half, but I'm not sure
mm,
how to distinguish whether it's due to like nerve or blood.
mm. Yeah, yeah, that's fair. What if I say that this patient was having tingling in their face? What would that then guide you towards?
Right. So since tingling is like a sensation, so I'm guessing that it's
Mhm.
something that picked up by like sensory receptors on the forehead. And so
Exactly.
that would probably be connected to like the nervous system, nerves that supply that area of the face.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, absolutely. And quite rightly, as you say, in terms of the face, there are different nerve roots and there are different nerves that are connected to each part of the face. Effectively, you've got the upper, middle third, and you've got the bottom third as well. And it just so happens to be that this particular pathogen, so this varicella zoster, aka shingles, affects the dermatome, so it affects particular nerve roots. In this particular case, has affected the upper uh, third, effectively, of the facial nerve that we can see on the left hand side. So it's really interesting just to see. So thank you for that. We're now going to move on now, completely different actually, to a different topic. So I want to ask you, what is cancer?
Right. So from what I understand, cancer is
Mhm.
like excessive proliferation of cells that occurs due to like accumulation of mutations, gene
Yes.
mutations that occur over time. Yeah.
Mhm. And tell me more. So it's the occurrence of multiple mutations over time.
Yeah. And so I think
Mhm.
There are like usually two types of mutations that lead to this, either like gain in function mutations that occur in like proto-oncogenes or loss in function mutations in tumor suppressor genes, and they usually cause like the cell cycle to be dysregulated. So this there are usually checkpoints, I believe, in the cell cycle that like determine whether the cell can continue dividing, and when these go wrong, it results in the cell dividing even when it's not supposed to.
Great.
Yeah.
So that is a fantastic answer. Clearly, you know all about cancer in terms of its mechanism there. That's really, really great. So how would you explain that to a 16-year-old
Right.
about how cancer happens?
Right. So I guess a 16-year-old will be familiar with like the idea of tumors. And so we could start off from there saying tumors are caused by cancer. And like since tumors are like masses of cells that have grown in areas where they were not supposed to initially. So cancer is something that happens when cells continue dividing even when they are not supposed to. And I think to go on from there, and then we would try explaining the reason why these cells are dividing when they're not supposed to, and that would be linked to how, I mean, I think at 16 years, maybe you would know things like mitosis and meiosis, maybe, and talk about how.
Let's say they don't. Let's say they
Okay.
don't know that.
All right. So, well, during cell division and things like that, you would need like the cell's genetic material to be able to replicate and things like that. And during that process, there might be some mistakes that are made, and usually the cell needs to be able to detect those mistakes. And when it's not able to, and the cell continues dividing, then these mistakes get continued on to like daughter cells again and again. And because of that, this might result in like uncontrolled division of the cells. Yeah.
And how would you explain this sort of gain of function, loss of function? Maybe if you can think of like an analogy or a simile that could quite nicely explain that.
Right. Okay, so I can't quite think of an analogy on the spot, but I think
Okay. So if you think about it in terms of being a car,
right.
and you think about it in terms of brakes and accelerators,
Okay.
and you mentioned gain of function and loss of function,
Yeah.
how could you perhaps relate that to a car and its brakes and accelerator?
Yeah, so maybe if we can think about like the genes that code for things as like the car per se, and then we have these other genes that code for things that are like the accelerator of this car. And so when we keep pressing the accelerator and we like exceed the speed limit of like the road, that results in like
Yep.
a gain in function mutation. And similarly, when we like there's like a sudden brake when you're
And if we
driving.
just pause there, if we
Yeah.
just pause there for a second, yeah, exactly that. So a gain of function mutation is kind of like having the accelerator on fully all the time, right? You can't take your foot off the pedal; it's permanently stuck on, going at full speed. Good. And then what about the loss of function?
Yeah, so loss of function, I think you can liken it to being able to like push the brakes on the car when you encounter a speed bump, for instance. But you're using the brake when you're not supposed to, maybe, or maybe you're pressing on the brake all the time. So that results in the car not being able to move, which is similar to like the gene not being able to like the gene not being expressed and not coding for any proteins that are required. Something like
Sure,
that?
but you said that cancer is uncontrolled cell division, right?
Yeah.
And in
So
this analogy, the speed of the car is equal to basically cell division speed. And we talk about, you know, the increase in cell division. So other than increasing the accelerator, how else can the speed of the car be increased?
oh, so do you mean like when the brakes are not working kind of thing?
Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
Tell me more.
So I guess when like there's a loss of function mutation, you're not able to control the brakes of the car, so that results in the car speeding up even when it's not supposed to. And so
Absolutely.
that's like the uncontrolled division part. Yeah.
Great, exactly that. And this is also true for like any regulatory mechanism, right? That you're going to have things that accelerate it and you're going to have things that decelerate it. So it's about thinking about the fact that a gain of function in the accelerating stuff and a loss of function in the decelerating stuff is then going to mean that the car or whatever process we're talking about is going to be occurring a lot faster. Very good.
Yeah.
Okay, so I'm going to move on now to a graph here. Can you firstly describe this graph for me?
Right. So I think this graph shows trends in the average number of cancer cases per year over a period of like from 0 to over 90 years old. And it also shows the incidence rate of the cancer per 100,000 people. And it also shows data for both males and females. And so if we were to look at the trend, I think in general, for both males and females, the incidence of cancer, the incidence rate is increasing throughout the lifetime. And specifically for females, the incidence rate seems to be higher than males from around 0 to 55 years old. And beyond that, the incidence rate is higher for males than for females. Yeah. And if we were to look at the number of cases themselves, they seem to start dropping after 70 to 74 years old for both males and females. Yeah. That is what I have so far.
Great. Okay.
Okay.
This is really useful to know. All right, so we've got a few things to look at. Firstly, are we looking at the bar chart or are we looking at the line graphs when it comes down to the rates?
So the rate would be the line graph. Yes, the line graphs.
Great.
Yes.
And what would be the cases then?
The cases would be the bar graphs, both the. Yeah.
Great. Fantastic. Curious that we've got both incidence and number of cases here, firstly. So you did a great job at describing it. Why do you think we're looking at both cases and rates? What's the difference between the two, sir?
Right. So I think number of new cases simply refers to how many cancer diagnoses are made, but the incidence rate is comparing the number of cases to a particular population size, in this case 100,000. And so I think the incidence rate might be a better reflection of the prevalence of like cancer in the population, because if we were to just look at the number of new cases, that doesn't account for the total population size. So and plus the fact that the number of people at each age group might be different as well. So when we look at
Fantastic.
the incidence rate per 100,000 people, we're able to have a standard basis for comparing them across the different age groups.
Good. So you can then compare them across different age groups. And say we were looking at this at the UK, say these were UK numbers. What else would be the benefit of having a look at incidence over the amount of cases? You said we can compare across different age groups. What else could we compare then across?
Do you mean in terms of like gender comparison, or?
That's one. Yep. What else could we be looking at?
Or like different.
And say if this is UK based data.
Right. As in, do you mean beyond this graph, what comparisons we could be making? So that could be either like different ethnic groups, different socioeconomic backgrounds as well, cancer prevalence. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And
also about different countries as well.
Oh, right. Yeah.
Oh, bless me. Yeah. And also different countries as well. So that's one thing to think about. Yeah. What else? So that would be the key things to be focusing on, the fact that that's the purpose of the incidence rate, that as you quite rightly say, the population amongst each age group can vary, and therefore also you can also do some comparisons in whatever sort of metric that you want to have a look at, and also critically between different countries. Really good. And could you explain why it is that the female rates effectively before 55 are higher than males, firstly?
Right. Well, I think, I'm not too sure, but if I were to hazard a guess, it could be thinking about what are the factors that contribute to cancer in the first place, and then seeing what could be more prevalent in females than males. So, for instance, maybe if we were to look at the biological differences between females and males, maybe around there might be certain changes in like the chemicals in the body, or like hormones in the body that occur at around that age of 55 to 59 that result in a lower prevalence of cancer among females after that.
So just to
Maybe
pause you there, what hormones are you thinking about?
maybe in females like estrogen, progesterone, things
Yes.
like that. Yeah.
Yep.
And maybe that gets me thinking, possibly maybe that's the age around which menopause occurs. Maybe that has an effect on the level of these hormones in females' bodies as well. Maybe that has an impact on how common cancer is among females. Yeah.
Very good. So that's really good to think about. And estrogen, let's focus on estrogen for the moment. Can you think of any cancers that can specifically or more broadly apply to females?
I'm thinking breast cancer, cervical cancer, maybe.
Yeah.
Yeah, those are what I can, ovarian cancer, those are the ones that I can think of. Yeah.
Yeah, good. Okay. So that's one thing to think about. So you're thinking about whether the true incidence is actually higher in females. Could it potentially be down to estrogen, for example, and there's more female exclusive cancers that could occur? That's one aspect of things to be thinking about. What else?
Um,
What else do we know can contribute to cancer, just generally?
do you mean like lifestyle factors, like
Yeah.
engaging in habits like smoking and also like level of exercise and obesity rates
Good.
amongst females and males could be different
Yep.
possibly. Yeah, so
Absolutely.
that could contribute to the difference as well.
What else in terms of behavior? Thinking about a specific type of cancer. Thinking
Um,
about particularly some people do it actually indoors, but the great majority of us like to do this in the summer months in a country abroad on the beach.
oh, do you mean like sun tanning? Wait.
Sun tanning, yeah, absolutely. So that's one aspect to be thinking about. So think about behavior such as UV exposure, for example.
Right.
And you've mentioned smoking, you've mentioned obesity. What else could we be thinking about as well?
Um, well, perhaps like occupational factors as well, but
Mm,
um, that would mean we would also need to find out whether there are certain occupations that females are more likely to be in compared to males, and what type of maybe occupational hazards that would expose them to that could be like carcinogenic factors that contribute to cancer.
yeah,
So
do you know any carcinogenic workplace factors?
like exposure to radiation, exposure
Mhm.
to asbestos maybe. Um,
Yes.
what
Great.
else?
This is really good. This is really good. Excellent. All right. So that's very useful. We'll come back to some of those risk factors, and perhaps you can use it now when we're talking about why actually then the male rates overtook effectively from 55 plus. What could be the reasons as to why, assuming that it is true incidence?
Um, Sorry, do you mean like apart from the factors we've discussed so far, or?
That's why for females, yeah. But now let's think about why
Right.
males would have a higher rate of cancer at 55 beyond.
Right. Um, well, similar to what we discussed for females, it could be the case that the type of cancers that are prevalent in men tend to develop at a later age compared to females. For example, from what
Such
I
as
understand, like colon cancer or wait, I can't think of the other one. Wait, uh,
what's the male equivalent of ovarian cancer?
do you mean like testicular cancer or?
Yeah,
Yeah,
exactly. Yep,
okay.
precisely. And what's another one as well that can particularly affect men
Prostate
when,
cancer?
yeah, good, prostate cancer. That's a massive one to think about. And absolutely, that's a big, big aspect to why male rates of cancer are actually higher. So that's one thing you want to be thinking about there. What else comes to mind? You mentioned it in terms of workplace.
Right, so, well, I'm not too sure. Maybe Well, in terms of workplace, do you mean like working in? Well, I'm not sure what other carcinogenic factors they may be exposed to. For example, like,
So you mentioned one. What was the one you said beginning of A?
like asbestos, like working in construction and
Asbestos.
things, which might be
Yeah,
more common among men as opposed to
perfect.
females.
Yeah,
So,
so that's one aspect.
right.
And you
What
can
else?
also think about like silicon particles causing like silicosis, for example. Again, something very similar. So that's one aspect that we can absolutely think about. So those are all thinking about the fact of firstly in terms of true incidence. But if we also take a step back, what also then would you want to think about if we don't take into account true incidence and we just think about detection? What's the difference between incidence and detection? Not a trick question.
Well, I think detection would involve being able to have methods that can detect the occurrence of these cancers and also how early this detection can occur as well, and
Good.
whether people actually show up to like screenings to have these cancers detected as well. So if we were to look at that, maybe it depends on how easily the cancers that tend to occur in females and males can be detected. So, for example,
Mhm.
I know that like screenings can be done for things like breast cancer and and pap smears and things like that that detect for cervical cancer as well. But I'm
Mm.
not sure what is the level of efficacy in terms of how early they can be caught, for instance. So that might
Mm.
for it could be the case that maybe cancers that occur in males tend to be detected at a later stage, and so when they are older as well compared to in females. And that
Good.
also makes me think about like the kind of screening programs and also the level of awareness about these cancers that males and females might have. It could be the case that screening programs for breast cancer, for instance, are more well known about, and that could induce more people to get themselves tested for breast cancer and screened regularly so that they can be caught at an earlier age. Yeah.
Very good. Excellent. So those are all fantastic points to be thinking about here. And now, just to finish up with this graph, is there any other information you'd want from this graph or that you're curious about?
Mm, perhaps like the specific types of cancers, or
Mm. And what do you mean by that?
like maybe what are the cancers, like is it different cancers that are being detected in males and females at different ages, or is it a certain particular cancer that still gets detected earlier in females and later in males, something like that.
Great.
um what else? I guess if we want to determine whether the differences is only due to gender, then we would want to try and maybe equalize other factors between these two groups. And so that could involve like maybe being able to conduct this kind of study, but within a certain either ethnic group or within a certain socioeconomic group as well, because that would
Mhm.
standardize other factors, and then that would allow us to compare whether the incidence is still only dependent on gender for these particular cancers, for instance.
Good. What
Yeah.
else would you want to know about that could be quite useful? So I think ultimately what we're getting at here is that not all cancers are created equal and that you've got different types of cancers. That's one thing. What else would you want to take into account or
Or
be
like
intrigued to know about?
things like what stage they get detected at, maybe.
Fantastic.
Yeah.
Tell me more.
Um, so, well, it could be that it could be possible that maybe the cancers that are detected in males are detected later, and they're also detected at like a later stage as well, because they have more time since they're being detected later. There's more time for the cancer to develop into a later stage, or um, it could also show like the efficacy of like um, methods of diagnosis and screening, and what stage of cancer we are able to catch the cancer at. Yeah.
Very good. Excellent. Really well done there. So we'll move on to the next and final scenario. So, how can cancers become resistant to anti-cancer treatment?
Right. Um, So, well, I don't know this specifically to cancer. What I do know is about like antibiotic resistance. I'm not sure if that's similar here. From what I understand, it could be like a case of some cancer cells are able to produce like proteins or chemicals that are able to maybe counter the drugs that are used in cancer treatment. And
Sure. I
and
mean,
as
if
a
I could
result,
pause you
yeah,
there for a second.
right.
Um, how do anti-cancer drugs work, firstly?
Um, since cancer involves like the dysregulation of the cell cycle and excessive proliferation, I'm guessing the drugs would probably be targeting chemicals and proteins maybe that are involved in the cell division process, or like
Mhm.
or if we were to look at maybe more gene-based therapies, it could be like silencing or enhancing certain genes. Like for example, if it was a gain in function mutation, we would want to reduce the expression of that kind of gene. So that could involve using drugs that are targeted towards that. Yeah, from what I understand.
Fantastic. So you could be targeting different genes, and you could target a gene pharmacologically, i.e., in terms of a drug that interferes with it, that inhibits it,
Yeah.
that stops it from working, or you can even interfere with a gene genetically by gene editing in the first place. So that's one aspect of things. Good. What else can you think about? That's all quite personalized and specific,
Right.
and really good in that way. What else can be used? Because that's quite a scalpel approach, but we also
Yeah.
tend to use a sledgehammer approach as well. What could be the sledgehammer approach?
Like chemotherapy and radiation.
Yeah.
And yeah. So, um, well, from what I understand about chemotherapy, it simply involves um, or like radiation. It involves um, like radiation on like the cells results in cancer cells being able to die, but actually I think all cells in the area would die, right? Not just cancer cells. Not too sure about
Yeah.
that. Yeah.
And what would that cause?
As in,
Other cells in the area dying. What would that cause?
so that would cause other symptoms like pain, loss of function in certain areas.
Great.
Um, yeah.
Fantastic. Absolutely. So it can then cause side effects, and that can also
Yeah.
therefore result in other facts in terms of, for example, vomiting, nausea. It can result in hair loss. It can also result into actual local physical damage to the local skin area as well. Very good. So, and now if we go back to our question about how can cancer become resistant to anti-cancer treatment, what comes to mind?
Well, I guess it could be the case that certain cancer cells are able to they have resistance to like radiation and they don't die as a result of the chemotherapy treatment. And so, because after each round, the cells that are able to continue living on would continue proliferating as well. So that creates, well, that creates resistance against like the treatments that we're using.
So that
Or,
describes a selection pressure, but
yeah.
how do they actually become resistant in the first place?
Um, Not too sure about this, but possibly certain mutations that occur that result in I'm not too sure about this part, the production of
Sure.
certain, yeah.
So you're absolutely right that, we're speaking about a selection pressure here. And this selection pressure is the same if we're looking at bacteria, if we're looking at cancer cells, if we're looking at it from a Darwinian perspective, and we think about ecosystems in terms of animal adaptations, it's the same thing, right? So what you explained is the propagation of that selection pressure. But the question is, what ultimately drives that initial change? And that initial change, as you mentioned, is a mutation. Now, there are all sorts of different mutations that cancer cells can make to become resistant to anti-cancer treatment. If you were a cancer cell, how would you mutate in order to become resistant?
Um, well, I think, well, other than the gain in function, loss in function mutations we discussed, uh,
That's
be-
how it is a cancer cell, but
yeah,
how does it stop itself from, how does it become resistant to an anti-cancer treatment?
right. Yeah, sure. I'm not too sure about the part like how the radiation itself affects the cells, so I'm not able to explain why the cell itself is able to protect itself from the
How could it?
chemotherapy.
If you had to guess, if you could mutate in any other sort of way, how would you become resistant to radiation?
Um, like certain proteins, certain factors that offer protection, but I'm not sure how. Yeah. Uh, what else?
So, okay, so one idea is to sort of strengthen the cell membrane potentially, so to
Yeah.
physically form a sort of like a larger, stronger shield. Yes. What does radiation particularly affect?
Um,
Or what is responsible for genetic material in our cells?
like, do you mean like DNA and radiation sort of just results in uh like the genome no longer being like able to express proteins and the genome just breaking down in general.
Precisely, that's exactly what happens. And
Right.
then once the cell recognizes the DNA to be so different from what it's used to, it
Yep.
triggers something known as, well, what do you know? Do you know what it
Apoptosis?
triggers?
Do you mean apoptosis or do you mean
Apoptosis, absolutely. So it
right?
then triggers apoptosis, right? So it then gets rid of itself effectively. So that's one aspect to be thinking about. So based on that alone, how could a cancer cell become resistant to anti-cancer treatment if we're saying that it relies on apoptosis?
Right. So in that case, like I guess it would be involving making the genes less resistant to damage due to radiation. And so maybe
That's
that
one
could
type.
include um like remodeling the chromatin, for instance, in genes. Like that could like make the genes more compact and so they are less likely to be targeted during radiation, less likely
Essentially.
to break down.
Good.
What
And
else?
what does chemotherapy, so again, quite similar in terms of sort of inflicting DNA damage, and radiotherapy, what do we say they relied on that you mentioned that begins with an A to work, to be destroyed by the anti-cancer treatment?
Apoptosis? Wait. Uh-huh.
Yes, exactly. Apoptosis.
Right.
So, what else could the cancer cell do?
So it could prevent being recognized for apoptosis. So
Fantastic.
yeah, um, the way in which that can happen could be. I'm guessing if the cell is because the cell has to be recognized by like I'm not sure if other cells or other factors that trigger apoptosis. So if these proteins or these factors are not expressed or their expression is being silenced, that could allow the cell to like go under the radar and not be
Great.
recognized. Yeah.
Fantastic. That's really, really good. And you mentioned this idea of having antigens. And if we were to say that the um, cancer cell, hmm, can you hear me still?
Yep.
Okay, great. So if we were to say that the cancer cell was expressing an antigen and that antigen was then being targeted by an anti-cancer treatment, how could that also guide you towards different mechanisms for cancer resistance?
So that would mean like mutations in the genes coding for that antigen present on the cell membrane. Do you mean such that the anti-cancer
Yep,
treatment is no longer like the molecules in that anti-cancer treatment can't bind to like these receptors, for instance, or these antigens present? Yeah.
so they
Uh,
couldn't bind to it. Why?
well, I'm guessing these treatments tend to be specific to the type of antigens present on cancer cells, and
Yeah,
so if there's mutation, there will no longer be that specificity and complementarity. Yeah.
good. So that's known as target modification. Fantastic. And there are two more mechanisms that come to mind, and I think we need to sort of zoom out a bit. So if we think about that, we're giving a very personalized anti-cancer drug through the blood, how will it get to the cell? Not a trick question.
Like through the bloodstream with a viral vector, maybe. used to deliver
Okay,
the
that's
gene.
very sophisticated. Okay, let's
Oh,
go with that. So let's go. Actually, let's not go with that. Let's not make it
okay.
too complicated. So
Yeah.
if we just say it's a bog standard molecule, it's a nanoparticle of some
Yeah.
description. How will that get into a cell?
Um, like it's just able to pass through the cell membrane, but I'm not too sure.
So if it
Like,
was a nanoparticle and it was small enough, it could pass through Y.
as in we're talking about a gene, or we're talking about like a cancer therapy.
The cancer therapy.
All right. So it either binds to receptors or it passes through like protein channels on the membrane, depending on what type of particle it is. Like,
Yeah, let's say it's very big, and actually now let's say it's charged as well. So how is it
right.
going to get into the cell?
Um, Either like a channel protein present or like other types of transport proteins that are present that have like,
Yeah,
yeah.
exactly. Because of course the membrane is lipophilic, it's got a
Yeah.
hydrophobic and hydrophilic side to it. And because the phospholipid membrane in and of itself is so large and charged, it is then able to repel again another large and charged particle, and thus it will need to go through a channel protein. Okay, there are two more mechanisms that have now been unlocked. What else can we be thinking about based upon that?
Right. So like, do you mean it's like preventing the entry of these like nanoparticles? So that would involve modifications to like the membrane proteins that occur.
Very
And
good.
so maybe like loss of like maybe like the hydrophilic pore that tends to be on the inside, so that prevents the entry of these hydrophilic particles.
Mhm.
One other thing could be what other mechanism? Well, so
So
far we
that's
yeah.
so far you're stopping it from getting in.
Yeah. And right, so
If
I
you
guess,
were in a boat and the boat was leaking, your
right.
first thing that you'd want to do is try and stop the plug, right?
Yeah.
What else would you want to also do if there was water in your boat?
Like you would scoop out the water.
Yeah.
So that would involve like breaking down of like whatever nanoparticles that manage to get inside the cells
Okay,
to
great. So you're trying to get to like literally destroy it in the actual cell itself.
or like
Okay.
expelling the nanoparticles somehow.
How could
Yeah.
you expel it?
So, well, that could involve maybe forming some sort of vesicle around the nanoparticles, maybe, and then transporting it back out of the cell via
Yeah, and how are you going to transport
exocytosol.
it out? If you remember, you've got a phospholipid membrane.
Yeah. Well, if it wasn't a vesicle, that would be like exocytosis, but if it's not, then it would be like these membrane proteins, but they work the other way around, like the direction in which they are able to transport the proteins can change, maybe. Yeah.
Good. So you've got efflux pumps, so you can have channel proteins that actually take it out as
Yeah.
well. Very well done. So if I show you this diagram here, absolutely, you've actually outlined all of this that could occur. So we spoke about DNA damage repair, for example, and we said about increased resistance to apoptosis. We
Yeah.
spoke about changes in drug target. We also mentioned actually changing the drug in itself, sort of decomposing it, and also decreasing drug uptake and also increasing drug efflux as well. And one other aspect as well is actually about drug compartmentalization. So, and this is effectively what you were mentioning in terms of vesicles in of themselves. All right, Andika, thank you so much, and really appreciate that. And thanks so much, guys, for watching. And don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. And we'll see you in the next one. Take care. Bye.